Chapter 31, Realism and Nominalism, Myths and Stories, Part 3. Do our perceptions give us true insight into what exists and is real? Or are our perceptions of reality simply the organizing framework of a chaotic universe? It's my conviction that these questions can only arise naturally from the mind of a sedentary body. No one cutting brush in the hot sun would believe that their experience to be an illusion. The connection between our physical experience when a cool breeze blows or a sharp branch scratches our skin is too visceral to be doubted. Yet so much of the information we base our life on comes through the experience of a second-hand narrative. How can our perceptions and experience help us navigate the narrative world? We approach the news or history or any expert opinion with a mixture of skepticism and trust, believing that there is truth, but it may be hard to find amidst the noise of bias, opinion, and ignorance. What if we apply this question to the realm of stories? Can stories reflect ultimate reality? And if so, do we seek or recoil from stories that reflect the nature of reality well? On the one hand, we can make a distinction between fiction and nonfiction. I could tell a story about my father or a fictional character. One layer of analysis would indicate that the story about my father could be true, while the fictional story cannot. But if the story about my father doesn't reflect the details of his life, can the character still be called my father? Realism versus nominalism. Hollywood industry insider and podcast host Dr. Nathan Jacobs has put forth quite a bit of time and energy toward the notion that all controversies of our current day can be seen as reflections in the ongoing debate between worldviews of realism and nominalism. Realism is rooted in the belief that our experience corresponds to an ontological reality. Nominalism, from the Latin nomen, for name, is the belief that our experience is a construct of culture, society, and tradition. Footnote: a nominal Christian is someone who identifies as a Christian but does not in any way seek to imitate Christ. They are a Christian in name only. End footnote. When a story is read, it is the correspondence to reality that makes it compelling to us. This explains both why writers of fiction become better with experience and why an autobiography can grip us, even if it's the first time an author puts words to the page. But there is one advantage that the writer of fiction has over all others, a power native to God himself, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. While only the words of God can call things into existence in the world in which we live, the author can accomplish the same thing in the world of imagination. Anyone can create worlds in this realm, but only those who have the gift to communicate them, whether by song, speech, written words, and images, can share their vision with others. In regards to these shared works of imagination, the question must be asked again. What makes one story so compelling while others are quickly forgotten? It is not correspondence with reality as we see, hear, and touch it, but correspondence with something deeper, a pattern of truth that undergirds reality as we inhabit it. This power is something that should be hallowed by the authors who have mastered it, for with the subtle applications of surprises and twists in the expected delivery of a story, they can change the way we view the world in which we live. When others seem blind to what only an artist can see, they craft a story to illuminate the mind of the listener. But this gift applies just as much to the interpretation of old tales as it does to the creation of new ones. One person may discover such a vision in the subtle dance of smoke and shadows, and share it in whispers that few can hear, while another hears those whispers and transforms them into blazes of lightning and roaring thunder. The imposition of imagination. This transformative magic is the power of a master movie maker like Denis Villeneuve. He turned the world of Arrakis into the vivid images that readers had long imagined in their mind, yet never dreamed they would see with their own eyes. Perhaps it is this ability of capturing the image that gives the cinematographer such power above other forms of storytellers. Not all readers are the same, but when a book is read or heard for the first time, the mind supplies the images. Sometimes the narrative will supply corrective descriptions of what our mind draws up, and it can be difficult to adapt. This is even more true if someone sees a movie before reading the book. They will likely always see the images of actors in their mind. Even those scenes not portrayed on screen will be enacted by the image of those actors as we read along. Imagination, the generation of images within the mind's eye, is a powerful creative tool, yet its delicate influence is easily overridden by what is seen with the physical eyes and later remembered. Because film is so much more engrossing than simple words on the page, an adaptation faithfully executed in the aesthetic domain supersedes the authority of even the most well-loved books, both on the strength of the memories created and the greater audience reach. This phenomenon leaves the movie maker with a crucial decision when crafting their works of art. Should they bring a new and unknown tale to the screen or adapt an existing story? In the case of the former, the film is the authoritative or canonical version of the tale. The movie is the authentic subject, the thing in itself, and if there is a book, it is written subsequently with very little new information. The mythology of the commercial age. Such is the case of Star Wars. Although George Lucas drew heavily from the novel Dune, he created a new story specifically for the medium of film. The real Luke Skywalker looks exactly like Mark Hamill, and the real Han Solo looks exactly like Harrison Ford. The paperback novelization tells the exact same narrative story as the movie, and the descriptive language of the characters and scenes correspond to their on-screen counterparts. The worldwide audience experienced the same version of Star Wars at the same time. Their imaginations were filled with the same images and the same emotions, as the unambiguous storyline directed them to root for scrappy rebels in opposition to the evil empire. The space between movies created room for imaginative speculation, but as the sequels were released, the definitive answers to audience questions were answered definitively, and awkwardly for anyone rooting for romance between Luke and Leia. Once the initial trilogy was complete, Lucas was glad to authorize many officially licensed novels and comic books within the Star Wars universe. The introduction of new narratives and characters that expanded the simple story he created in a truly galaxy-sized meta-narrative. So long as authors honored the spirit of his vision, they could place their own planets, species, heroes, and villains within that galaxy far, far away. Yet once the movie sequels were released, beginning in 2015, all the stories written by authors centered around the main events and characters from the original films became unmoored from canonical story, just as the imagined romance between Luke and Leia was dissolved by the revelation of their familial relation. The imaginative visions of those authors were now part of the Star Wars story in name only. Despite this official position of the owners of the Star Wars intellectual property, there are many people who took great umbrage at the official continuation of the story that finally arrived 32 years after the 1983 release of Return of the Jedi. Many of those fans had been fueling their enthusiasm for the story by reading novels, and the ones that most captured the spirit of the audience imagination were the three-book series written by Timothy Zahn, first released in 1991. Not only had these novels become a deeply entrenched part of the expanded fan experience over the next 24 years, but the narrative was centered on the main characters from the original films, and the events occurred shortly after the ending of the on-screen narrative. To those who had read and reread these stories after each viewing of the original films, Zahn's vision of what happened next had become real. To have the story they had grown up with tossed into the dustbin of history due to the legal ownership of an intellectual property by a profit-driven corporation had decided to go in a different direction. Although I had read many novels in the Star Wars universe during my teenage years, I always thought the level of devotion serious fans put into the franchise was a bit silly. Though the long-form nature of books meant that I had spent many more hours exploring that galaxy in my mind's eye than I did in front of the silver screen, it was never lost on me that the official lore of the Star Wars universe was based on the movie, and a movie seemed like a silly thing to center your identity around. Star Wars is and always has been an entertainment franchise, and is best enjoyed while eating popcorn. Imagination inoculation. There are two things that inoculated me from a youthful obsession with the cult of Star Wars fandom. First were the books on our living room bookshelves, with works by the Inklings and their influencers, including a second edition set of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, with tattered paper dust covers, and several works by George MacDonald. The second thing was the overflowing volumes on many bookshelves that filled our parents' room, the basement, hallways, and even the room I shared with my brother. Most of these works were theological or religious in nature, and they had been collected for the sake of curiosity long before my father became a pastor. It was a long time before I had first attempted to read The Lord of the Rings, and I took a few starts before I finally finished it. By that time, I had already spent many hours poring over the maps and leafing through the glossaries of runes and other strange letters in the back of the book. In matters of authorial intent and canonicity, Tolkien raised the bar to a height that remains unmatched. No one was going to try to mess around in the world he created. It was too real. His world had not just one, but several whole new languages, and each of his nations and tribes had histories, mythologies, poems, songs, and ways of life. He drew maps and charted the distances and topography from place to place within his world. This was not just the facade of ancient lore that often appears in fantasy books as chapter epigraphs. If he quoted a poem in the story, the whole poem exists. He created the world that he wanted to inhabit and play in. In many ways, the most remarkable thing about Tolkien's story is that Lewis convinced him to pause his exploration long enough to get some stories written down. Compared to Tolkien, almost every fantasy world seems dull, but Star Wars has about the same depth as the cardboard cutouts in the theater lobby. But right next to Tolkien's works on the shelf was a 1970s boxed set of Lewis' The Chronicles of Narnia, with a slightly newer edition of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. At first glance, the Narnia stories are far more silly than Star Wars, but despite the childish whimsy, there was something of substance to the story, because those children's childish tales were not built on the framework of a single author's imagination. They were a continuation of the conversation that was filling all those theology books. Tolkien and Lewis had figured out the connections between the story on the page, the images in our mind, and the world in which we lived and breathed. For many years before these men wrote their own stories, other men had been tearing stories down. To believe was a sign of ignorance, while to doubt was a sign of enlightenment. This path down the road of nominalism could dissolve any structure of thought. What Lewis termed nothing buttery because anything could be described as nothing but the sum of its constituent parts until everything turned to dust and the world was remade in the image of the men with the power of will to shape it. This process began long ago with the myths of antiquity. As we've discussed, the pagan stories of Homer and Virgil, heaven and Hades, gods and giants, and even good and evil became metaphors to help primitive man explain the natural world. But the critique could not be stopped, and as it eroded trust in the stories of Christianity, so too did it dissolve the institutions that held the fabric of society together. With no shared story, the fraternal bonds of humanity dissolved. The entire world descended into war. In many ways, it was the encounter with evil that unlocked the pattern of reality for these men. There was no neutrality. The reduction of everything to its constituent parts was meant to erase superstitions and injustices, but once society dissolved back into the clay, everyone's vision for how the world should be rebuilt served their own self-interests, or the interests of those who promised them prestige, power, and pleasure. Symbols, stories, and images became tools that would shape the minds of men. By reducing their enemies to something less than human, a soldier did not strive against another man. He exterminated pests. There was no difference between applying a pesticide to a colony of ants or applying lethal gas to trenches filled with subhuman foreigners. Lewis best displayed the final outcome of this worldview in his science fiction novel, That Hideous Strength, a narrative expansion of his nonfiction work, The Abolition of Man, whose title expresses the functional result of this reductionistic line of thought. In the absence of belief in God, we will fill the vacuum with gods of our own inventions. The elite of humanity will promise to lead us to a better future as they blindly follow the demons leading us to hell. The turning point in Lewis' novel comes when the central character, Mark Studdick, applies the logic of the reductionist worldview to the instructions of his masters. As a final act of initiation into the inner ranks of the elite, Mark spends a significant amount of time in a place called the objective room. A man of trained sensibility would have seen at once that the room was ill-proportioned, not grotesquely so, but sufficiently to produce dislike. It was too high and too narrow. Mark felt the effect without analyzing the cause, and the effect grew on him as time passed. Sitting, staring about him, he noticed the door and thought at first that he was the victim of some optical illusion. It took him quite a long time to prove to himself that he was not. The point of the arch was not in the center. The whole thing was lopsided. Once again, the error was not gross. The thing was near enough to be the true to deceive you for a moment and to go on teasing the mind even after the deception had been unmasked. The labeling of the objective room by its architects was in fact an intentional deception consistent with the overall design, as it was in reality the subversive room. The subtle changes from the expected dimensions, as well as the strange artwork described later, all combine to give an effect of something wrong. The precise nature of this wrongness is not disclosed, tempting the skeptic to dismiss it. But to dismiss it, one must accept the notion that you are being objective. Much like the sign on the door, this assumption blinds us to perceiving any errors of our own perception. In the intervening years since Lewis wrote his story, there has been an explosion of research assuming random and chaotic origins, though it was conducted via methods that emerged out of a Christian worldview. Yet virtually every discovery indicates that life is far more complex than we once imagined, as experiments produced results indicating order and intelligence at every step along the evolutionary path. In the early part of the 20th century, most scientists would have anticipated something like a miracle pill that would ensure perfect health and longevity for all humans. In anticipation of this coming scientific salvation, all conventions of morality and human tradition became optional in the eyes of the elite, though many are still perpetuated through cultural inertia. But to the extent to which they have been abandoned, pure chaos has ensued. The privileged classes have become addicted to digital delusions, while the urban poor have been reduced to pure chemical dependency. For Mark Studick, the breaking point of his own delusion comes from his mentor's insistence that he desecrate a crucifix within the objective room. Quote, "This," said Mark, pointing at the with an undefined reluctance to the horrible white figure on the cross, "this is all surely a pure superstition." Well, if so, what is their objective about stamping on the face? Isn't it just as subjective to spit on a thing like this as to worship it? I mean, damn it all. If it's only a bit of wood, why do anything about it? End quote. Mark is correct in questioning the ritual, as there is no more reason to do it than not to, except perhaps because he is being instructed to as a part of the initiation. But even arbitrary obedience leads one to question why, and any reason given betrays the existence of some kind of standard, something more than the nominal, the arbitrary, or the reductionistic nothing buttery. As he struggles with these thoughts, Mark comes to another conclusion. He found himself looking at the crucifix in a new way, neither as a piece of wood nor a monument of superstition, but as a bit of history. Christianity was nonsense, but one did not doubt that the man had lived and had been executed thus by the Bellbury of those days, and that, as he suddenly saw, explained why this image, though not itself an image of the straight or normal, was yet in opposition to crooked Bellbury. It was a picture of what happened when the straight met the crooked, a picture of what the crooked did to the straight, what it would do to him if he remained straight. It was, in a more emphatic sense than he had yet understood, a cross. In the image of a cross, the objectivity of the crooked room is exposed. There is no such thing as a pure social construction. There are only various degrees of participation with and rebellion against the truth of ultimate reality. The nominalist may claim that a cross is a socially constructed symbol, defined as the intersection of two straight lines at their midpoints, or at a prescribed ratio, such as 3:1 or 4:1, joined at precise 90-degree angles. They can use this set of definitions to dismiss anything else as not being a cross, or they can subvert the criteria to make anything they want fit the new definition of a cross. They can use these tools to ascribe randomness to purpose when they wish to tear down, and equate crookedness with straightness when they wish to replace or rebuild. Whatever objection is raised, it is nothing but, and fills in the blank, superstition, fundamentalism, delusion, corruption, envy, etc. When nothing buttery is applied to a cross, the simple symbol of a cross, or its physical manifestation, the foolishness breaks down. Even a child's drawing will suffice. A cross is the intersection of two straight lines. Imperfections do not tarnish the symbol because they can only be measured against an ideal. They are straight or not straight. See A and F in Figure 1. The length of the lines will be equal or unequal, A and B. If the cross point is not centered, the length of the two arms are still represented in a measurable ratio, B and C. If the angle of the intersections is not perfect, it is still represented by two sets of quadrants with equal angles, D. If one or both cross members is not straight, the angles of the four quadrants will still add up to 360 degrees, E, and F. This concept is important because both within Lewis' narrative and in the world in which we live, the fuzzy edges of the reductionist critique seek to lay hold of the levers of power by labeling religious thought as superstition. These arguments were compelling because much religious tradition is superstitious, and even elements with reasonable origins have often endured through superstitious practice. These statements were reasonable critiques for rejecting a system like medieval Catholicism in favor of something like Enlightenment deism. Yet once the notion of even a silent God or a prime mover was removed, the underpinnings of science and technology became ultimately doomed. All the mathematics necessary for the scientific endeavor still rely on the distinctions implicit in a cross, even an imperfect cross. The phones and computers on which these words are read, by which movies are made, the current and flow of electricity depend on binary distinctions. But to reject intelligence as the source of these properties means that nothing can be trusted or believed, because the idea of human intelligence becomes merely a social construct. If these claims are true, they are unknowable and meaningless, because truth, without its antithesis, is a concept with no meaning. However, if there is such a thing as truth, there can be such a thing as lies, and lies can say anything, but they still reflect the truth by their contradiction. This points to the powerful, creative, and regenerative tool of imaginative stories that allow us to find the truth, because what is good and bad, true and false, are rarely self-evident in our world. Some parts of Lewis and Tolkien's stories were seeking an answer to the question, can good be brought out from the evils of death and war? The desire to answer these questions, whether asked explicitly or merely in the background of their memories, directed the path their stories took. When I sit down to write, I have an idea that I want to come across, but as I see the words appear on the screen, they force me to refine the idea into something that will make sense to a reader, someone who certainly doesn't have all the same experiences or memories that I have. There is a way that the story must come out if it is to work. If I write that water flows uphill, it will not make it so. If I write a story with water flowing uphill without explanation, it will be a silly story, taken lightly, perhaps as satire or as an exercise in absurdity. If I want to take people deeper into thought, I have to explain why the water flows uphill. I have to create another world, or a being capable of changing or manipulating the laws of physics to prove the result. How long and how hard I work to solve this problem is dependent on why I am telling this story and how important this idea is. If it's merely to indicate that my world is different from our own, I may decide that water flowing uphill is a bad change and go with purple grass instead. But if the point is to challenge people to change their perceptions of our own world, I may work at it until it makes sense. If I truly wanted to influence people, for good or for ill, there is a quality of truthfulness that must be present in my story. It's not about writing things in this world. It's about writing things in a true world, a world that works, one that hangs together. And the parameters for such a world are extremely narrow. In fact, virtually all authors fail to one degree or another, and these are the areas in which the experience of the readers makes up the difference. Most errors are charitably interpreted in the mind of the reader, and the story still accomplishes its task. But when the author makes a serious mistake, they receive sharp criticism from those who know why it's wrong or isn't true. If it's a mistake, the criticism is of the writer's ability. He doesn't know how to write science fiction because he doesn't understand science. But if the error is intentional, the criticism is of his character. He wrote that character poorly because he's a misogynist. Tolkien's world is filled with real songs, poems, and works of history and mythology. But to become real within the realm of Middle-earth, they needed to have their origin within that world. Tolkien did not simply write the stories, but he wrote the story makers. Bilbo Baggins, protagonist of The Hobbit, is the author of that account and the beginning of his nephew Frodo's tale. Bilbo's book, titled There and Back Again, contains the bulk of Tolkien's novels. There is a device in writing called the unreliable narrator. It's what you get when the only witness to an amazing event was the town drunk or someone with an ulterior motive. The unreliable narrator introduces ambiguity into a text. It leaves the ultimate conclusion of a story up for interpretation. There is truth to the concept. It reflects the way that stories become legends. Tolkien does not want his story subject to wildly personal interpretations. He could have imagined the way a myth becomes fuzzy and distorted over time. He wanted his myth to be well preserved, yet he wanted it to have the gravitas of a true story. The best way to do this was to put a writer inside the tale. Bilbo is an author, like Tolkien. He struggles to find the right words at times. It takes him years to write down events that happened in the span of a few months. He is meticulous and precise. Tolkien put himself into the character of Bilbo so that we could take Bilbo's account seriously. Meta-narrative. By creating this second-order narrative, Tolkien's work becomes Bilbo's meta-narrative, the story about the story. The Lord of the Rings is Tolkien's narrative, and the story of its authorship, including Tolkien's life and his friendship with Lewis, are written as meta-narrative. Our interest in Tolkien's biography cannot be separated from his authorship of the tale. In the previous chapter, I wrote about the process of discovery that comes about through writing. While there was a point in Tolkien's life when The Lord of the Rings had not been penned, that Tolkien is a different man from the later author. What changed him? It was not the physical process of spending much time writing words in ink on paper. It was the exploration of the world and its tales within his mind. When Tolkien closed his eyes in Oxford, he could just as easily open them to the fields of the Somme or the plains of Osgiliath. One was memory and one imagination, yet each shaped the man he would become, and both informed the other. There are two counterintuitive truths about this interplay between memory and imagination. The first is that memories can change. If it seems odd at first to say that memories can change, there is ample evidence. The field of psychiatry has dealt with this for a long time. People are prompted to explore their memories by questions, and by seeking to explore the answers, they uncover new details. The power of imagination to influence these memories has now been recognized as dangerous, and therapists need to be careful not to insert ideas into the mind of a patient, because once the idea of a past trauma or abuse becomes commingled with fragments of memory, it is far more difficult to remove. If there is no way to find hard evidence of past events that can clarify what really happened, a patient and their relationship with those involved can become irreparably damaged. Yet verifiable facts and physical evidence can also bring incredible light to past events. In my own life, the later discovery of certain facts has recast the way I think about much of my past. This can cause pain, but also healing and forgiveness. Just like a narrative twist or a surprise revelation in a story, a startling discovery about one's past can recast the entire story of a person's life. These are meta-narrative changes, whether they come from empirical evidence or exploration of the memory from a later point of view. The other counterintuitive fact is the limitations of imagination. These limitations are entirely dependent on the individual and their ability to synthesize narrative with meta-narrative. One of the biggest pieces of evidence of this is the huge number of unfinished stories in publication. The beginning of a story is always a novel premise. It may be familiar, but if it is to be an imaginative tale, it must include something new. Dune was Hamlet retold, with some twists and extrapolations, and The Lion King was the same story told differently yet again. What if Hamlet was not an heir to a throne, but a daughter whose marriage would result in a crown for her husband? What if the king was not killed by a jealous uncle, but by an abused wife? What if Hamlet was truly the son of his father's brother? All of these twists and more have been explored in fiction, as have the possibilities of our own history, had things gone differently. What if the assassination of JFK had been thwarted? Or if the plot against Hitler had not failed? What if the South had won the Civil War? What if Eve had not eaten that fruit in the garden? We cannot explore these questions without delving into the realm of meta-narrative. Just as these twists can provide answers to the questions about what would happen if the past were written differently, they can also help us navigate our own lives. The greatest authors succeed in answering these questions. Sometimes it repairs our common tales. Hamlet is a tragedy, something we don't desire for our own life. Yet it's not enough to ask, what if Hamlet's father never died? Fathers do die, as do many other people whom we love, with tragic regularity, and often in senseless ways. How can we navigate these tragedies to avoid falling into despair? Tolkien did not enjoy tragic endings, and so his narrative was written as a eucatastrophe, a story that ultimately resolves all the points of conflict. These stories can make us feel good, but only to the extent that they can be believed. The mechanism used to resolve the tragic elements is where the power of the story relies. The Roman playwrights resorted to the use of deus ex machina, the god from the machine, in which a literal god character was lowered onto the stage to magically solve the problems with his unique powers. This ending is satisfying to those who seek stories for distraction and entertainment, but the implausibility makes it too weak to provide meaning for our own lives. A better solution is the competent execution of a system of justice. The detective ferrets out the details, and the wrongdoers are punished, or the good army defeats the bad one. These resolutions do occur, and sometimes more often than not, but only at a certain level of story. We can believe that the lone sheriff in the lone western town can root out the bandits and bring them to heel. We all know that the Allied forces beat the Axis of evil in the Second World War. But when we zoom out farther, the sleepy western town is the exception. The big city corruption of the police is the rule. The communist forces in Europe and China won far more than what was lost by Germany and Japan. The common narrative of the human race is tragic indeed. Yet the hope of resolution persists in our storytelling. Even as our common use of folk tales, myths, and faith in holy books have waned in the modern age, the authors of our entertainment seek to find new ways to reach the eucatastrophic resolution. Meta-narrative imagination gives us a powerful tool to right those wrongs. Worldview and world building. Of the emergent elements in recent storytelling, it is the multiversal and meta-narrative theme that has clearly captured the imagination of our age. This storytelling device can be seen as a philosophical evolution that takes us past the modernist nadir of tragic nihilism and the apex of postmodern subversion. It is for this reason that I like the term metamodernism to describe this new way of viewing the world. We can think of metamodernism as the result of a progression through 4 stages or 5 stages of worldview. In the pre-modern/ancient world, the deus ex machina was more believable and also far more terrifying. The atmosphere was saturated by the presence of gods and spirits, yet these powerful beings were far more likely to steal, kill, or ravish an individual as they were to bless or reward. If a hopeful outcome was to occur, it was at the pleasure of the gods alone. This was a chaotic worldview in which people had no clear expectation of correspondence between the actions and outcomes of their lives. The monotheistic revolution, and specifically the spread of Christianity, provided the first taste of the eucatastrophe. What was hinted at in the writings of the Jewish faith was made explicit in the New Testament apocalypse of St. John. The corrupt gods of the machine would meet their just fate at the hands of Christ with the coming of his everlasting kingdom. We can expand this view to include the influence of everything from Socrates to Muhammad. It provided a foundation for believing that there was an ordered and intelligible nature to reality, and provided the basis for the scientific method. This worldview is often called traditional or pre-modern, but it really forms the basis of what modernism truly is. Modernism is often described as the victory of the scientific worldview. Modernity promised that the eucatastrophe would be ushered in by abandoning superstitious religious beliefs by trusting in science. However, what it actually entailed was the removal of the base on which the scientific endeavor was founded, the intelligible, ordered nature of the universe. Its founding is often credited to the Enlightenment, and it's culminated in the events of the Second World War. This worldview placed rational and empirical evidence as the sole criteria for defining reality. And since these tools can only measure the physical and material aspects of reality, the modern definition of reality was reduced to the physical and material. Postmodernism was a reaction to the nihilism produced by modernism. The disconnect between the promises of the Enlightenment and the reality of the world wars and the other tragic outcomes of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of totalitarianism caused people to seek a sense of meaning outside that which could be measured with the tools of empiricism. It was a rejection of grand narratives that had stripped away the liberty of the individual. To answer the question of why the Enlightenment ethos they embraced had resulted in such tragedy, they viewed all narratives through a lens of power struggles. Thus, they could dismiss all forms of tradition, patriotism, or religion as manipulative tools employed by the powerful to oppress the weak. Since the spiritual aspects of reality had been stripped away through modernity, the only place to look for meaning was in the subjective experiences of the individual. This has led to our current state of individualistic hedonism. We can compare these worldviews through simple narrative arcs that would govern the life expectations of an individual. 1. Pre-modern/ancient. The universe is ruled by fate and chaos. Happiness and tragedy are outside of our control. 2. Traditional monotheist. The universe is created by God for a purpose. Human joy and suffering are both meaningful parts of that purpose. 3. Modernism. The universe is a mechanical product of matter and physics. Humans must discover their value through survival of the fittest. 4. Postmodernism. The universe as we perceive it is a construction of our subjective experiences. Meaning comes through discovering our authentic selves and resisting imposed power dynamics. These simple narrative arcs are by no means definitive, but they do give an example of the contrasts that have emerged as cultures progressed through these worldviews. A meta-modern worldview, or a post-postmodern worldview, realizes that as the limitations of each worldview have been discovered, the subsequent worldviews have not sufficiently resolved the problems, but rather reduced the options available to provide meaning for life. Modernism could not tolerate the mutually exclusive truth claims between theism and materialism, which cannot be definitively resolved. Rather, it went forward with the choice to embrace the latter as truth through something called logical positivism. Postmodernism resolved the conflict by constantly asking the question, cui bono? Who benefits? Who is the one gaining power? This gave them someone to point fingers at, but it left the construction of a meaningful life up to the individual, who has now been told that religion is false, science and government are corrupt, and the highest form of truth is subjective experience of the individuals, ranked by the total number of intersecting points of victimization. The meta-modern worldview must acknowledge the benefits and pitfalls of each previous way of navigating the world, but it must have a light grasp. This is why the means through which I have communicated in this book is a focus on the gist and the gestalt. The crisp edges of mutually exclusive truth claims are not done away with. They are absolutely necessary for hard sciences and engineering, but they can't explain the meaning of life. The subjective experience of marginalized individuals is not something we can ignore, but it can't be used as a cudgel against others. It also can't reject out of hand the realm of the spiritual and value of religious traditions. The scientific method means that to test a hypothesis, you must control all the variables. But the variables that govern human society and individual experience are far too complex to be controlled. The philosophical experiment of worldview development must be reset. Everything must be put back on the table. This is why a meta-narrative is required to make sense of the world in which we live. The stories we tell about history and culture are all too simple to encompass the complexity of the world we inhabit. The fascinating thing is that when we consider the narrative of history not from the standpoint of one nation or one culture, we find that all the previous worldviews are still intact at various places. The progression from pre-modern to postmodern worldviews really only makes sense of what we call the Western world. The worldviews based on the Eastern religions of Buddhism and Hinduism reacted very differently to the advent of modern science, as have the cultures of Africa. Anyone born in the 21st century can access the same information on the internet, regardless of where they were born. But what they do with that information will vary widely based on the culture in which they live. Tribes in the Amazon don't need to accept the history of modernism and postmodernism before integrating what they learn online into their current worldview. It would be detrimental. The greater value is for our world, as it presents itself online, to be informed by the person who truly understands the Stone Age wisdom in which they live. Multiversal truth. Throughout this book, I have and will continue to use the same kind of linear progression through chronological history to examine topics like the evolution of philosophical worldviews above. But while such a timeline may map onto a single culture or even a general area like the West, it's very limited in making sense of the whole scope of what happens in the world. The dispensational model of Christian history falls somewhat into the same error. It divides history into neat epochs based on particular events, when God updates the rules that govern his interactions with people. The clearest dividing line is the resurrection. Yet it makes sense that what happens in Jerusalem in 30 AD doesn't affect the people in the Americas who won't hear the name of Jesus for another 1400 years, the same way it affects the residents of Judea. The narrative arc of the Bible doesn't really fit that idea. While the events at Calvary represent the central message of the Gospels, Jesus' ministry had a variety of impacts on different groups in the region. What he said and did in Samaria, the Decapolis, and in Judea produced different results among different groups. The ministry of the disciples sent out before the resurrection had a spread, perhaps reaching those in Ephesus before the arrival of Paul. Footnote, this is in reference to Acts 19, 1-6, when Paul encounters believers who have not heard of the Holy Spirit. End footnote. For the Gentiles, the gospel message completed a story that went from the flood or Babel until the advent of Christ. For the Samaritans, Jesus reconciled the bitter divorce from the Jews described in the book of Ezra. For the Ephraimites, he was the Messiah, son of Joseph, whom they anticipated since their own departure from the house of David in the days of Rehoboam. It is the same way in our day. Some cultures fit into traditional, modern, and postmodern worldviews, while others blend them. You can find such a mix among the households in any neighborhood. The major cities in a state will be more postmodern than the small towns, and the rural areas closer to being traditional. Groups like the Sentinelese have preserved truly ancient ways of life in total isolation. The fictional multiverse is a far better reflection of what we see in the real than a timeline of successive and all-encompassing epochs. The idea of parallel realms has been present since the first page of Genesis, when God created the heavens and the earth, and has been explored through mythologies and stories ever since. The idea suffered a brief absence during the age of modernity, and what we discovered was that our lone physical world was neither big enough nor malleable enough to conform to the many conflicting visions of powerful men and nations. The writers of comic books, science fiction, and fantasy all latched onto this idea in the 20th century, some more concerned with the why and how than others, but eventually it made its way into discussions in the philosophy of science. It's been used as a hypothesis to explain the fine-tuning of the universe. Scientists in many fields of study, from physics and astronomy to chemistry and biology, have all come to realize that the variables necessary for life are so precise that the idea of spontaneous and random forces throwing them together is essentially impossible. Those who are adamantly opposed to the idea that reality comes from an intelligent design have embraced a theory of infinite universes where every possible variation of a universe must exist, though it introduces a new set of problems, such as being completely unverifiable and failing to explain the source of these infinite universes. The way such realms play out in a given fiction tips us off to the telos under which that multiverse operates. In the Marvel Universe's Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, the random world where everything is made of paint tips us off to the nature of the creative force behind these worlds. A more humorous telling of the same principle comes from the show Rick and Morty, where slightly more discernible absurdities are the norm. Yet the answers we truly seek from the multiverse are those of the worlds nearly identical to our own, or the ones branching off from the tiniest choices in our distant past. What if I had gone left when I chose to go right? What if I had done something different at a crucial moment in my life? Science has not provided definitive answers to these questions, nor has it provided evidence that such questions can be answered as observation point to determinism. Not only can we never go back to Eden, but Adam and Eve were doomed from the start. Yet fiction allows us, in some small way, to explore the possibilities, and through both writing and reading, we create these alternate realms. They are not so sturdy as the world our feet are planted in, but they grow more substantial as we furnish them, inhabit them, and invite others to explore alongside us. Sometimes this is disastrous. When the foundations of the worlds we built are insecure, the Star Wars fan base can attest to this. But this turns toward the meta as the only remaining option for fiction. This turn towards the meta as the only remaining option for fiction, the sciences, and religion, must cause us to ask the question, what is common among these many worlds? It is the search for meaning, for purpose, for a telos that we can understand, and it's seen most clearly in our tragedy, our failures, and our pain. When chaos and randomness sat at the foundation of our reality, we longed for hedon to numb our pain and silence our fears. But what succor can hedone give to those who never taste it? We long to see that the tragic, painful, and wasteful mistakes of our lives have not been suffered in vain. If someone learned from our mistakes or made a better choice, if they simply shed a tear, our story would be filled with meaning, with worth, with value. This hope of being seen, heard, and understood is at the root of the greatest stories that we tell. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Many of us question the passion with which environmentalists will advocate for the preservation of some rare bug or bird. But the fear behind that passion is that without someone to see or hear or notice, we ourselves could vanish, and no one would ever care. Blueprints of a better future. Stories are the way we make sense of the past and the way we shape our hopes for the future. Ultimately, what the meta-modern and meta-narrative turns seek to unite is not the diversity of stories, but the multiplicity of storytellers. Perhaps it's the nostalgia of my youth, but I can think of no greater example of this idea than the classic episode of Star Trek The Next Generation titled Darmok. For those unfamiliar, the episode is focused on the Enterprise's interaction with an alien species called the Tamarians. The ship's universal translator, which conveniently renders all foreign languages into English, seems incapable of making sense of the Tamarian language, or more specifically, the Tamarian mode of communication. All the words besides proper names are quite familiar, but the structure of sentences seems to be complete gibberish. In an effort to make a connection, the Tamarian captain Dathon has Captain Picard and himself transported to a remote wilderness, cut off from the communication with the rest of the crew. The alien repeatedly tries to communicate by repeating phrases such as Temba, his arms wide, and the titular sequence of Darmok on the ocean, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, Darmok and Jalad on the ocean. Over the course of the episode, Picard finally begins to understand that Dathon is alluding to stories from the culture of the Tamarians. Whether fictional, mythological, or historical is not relevant. The shared understanding of these tales is the way the Tamarians communicate. The difficulty is that the Tamarians have shed the grammatical and narrative structure around these stories. The stories had become like hieroglyphic icons, each one containing a substance married to its own context. There is no way to say, "Let me tell you a story." The story simply is. To create a bond of understanding, Dathon created the only type of structure he knew that the two captains could both relate to, an embodied experience. Unbeknownst to Picard, the wilderness contained a nearly invisible beast. Dathon endured the brunt of the beast's ferocity for the sake of forging a bond of understanding between the two men. He placed himself in the role of Darmok and cast Picard as Jalad as they faced the beast of Tanagra, two strangers who became friends through a shared struggle. Picard relates the story of Gilgamesh to Dathon shortly before the alien captain ultimately succumbs to his wounds, and the understanding between them forms the cornerstone of a new relationship between the children of Tama and the Federation, captured in their language as Picard and Dathon at El Andrel. 5 words that in some way encompass the entirety of 2 civilizations. Of course, the depth of research that goes into an episodic science fiction show can't stand up to the level of psycholinguistic analysis some critics would like to make. How can a species that only speaks in parables discover the intricacies of space travel? But that misses the point. What Darmok illustrated so beautifully is the reality of what we experience through stories. The word Darmok then enters our vocabulary as an icon of that which unites us with our fellow person, be they man or alien. What this showcases so beautifully is the ability of meta-narrative to sort out the differences between realism and nominalism. Nominalism is the worldview of the universal translator. When it cannot extract meaning from the stream of words it is fed, it reduces it to low intelligence. There is an aspect of the Tamarian language that makes it seem like low intelligence. The critique that you couldn't ask your neighbor for a 3/4-inch socket has a bit of reason in it, but I think we should take it in another direction. The writers of the episode, whether well-versed in the Western canon or simply swimming in the waters it produced, sought to write an episode about the problems of communication. The backdrop of the story was the ancient myths of the past, the fictional myths of the Tamarians, and the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. But you cannot mention Gilgamesh and a problem with misunderstood language without reaching the Tower of Babel, a story in which God confuses the language of the people because they are too united in their goals. They are addicted to an unhealthy lifestyle in need of an intervention. The evolution from the first alphabetic language in Canaan to the Phoenician and Greek languages tell a story of people reconstructing long-forgotten tales. Dathan and Picard's experience echoes the legends of Atlantis, kept by a priest of Egypt, told to the Athenian Solon, then to the grandfather of Plato, who finally wrote them down. Each step required charity and attention to make sure the other person fully understood. The continual progress towards precision in our language has not always made us kinder or more united, but has often made us more confident in our self-deception. Footnote. An interesting, though problematic idea from Peter Ruckman is that the English language allows for a greater level of precision than Hebrew and Greek, an argument he used to claim that the KJV Bible was a divinely inspired translation that surpassed the original language documents. End footnote. Let us then use the power of imagination to go back to that culture before the Tower of Babel and imagine, what if their language had been united to a better purpose? When the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible to them." Does that nothing include space travel? It's enough to form the basis of a pretty good story, one that could make us think and feel things that change the way we live our lives. Does this mean that the language of Eden consisted of stories? Perhaps not, but Dr. Ian McGilchrist has made the claim that humans almost certainly learned to sing before we spoke. Science has means of testing such ideas, but only the imagination can craft the hypothesis. Would McGilchrist have explored the possibility of such an idea if both Tolkien and Lewis had not created fictional worlds that were sung into existence? We can't go back to find out, but I think it's unlikely. When every voice of expertise tells us to reduce and collapse what our senses tell us into impulses and reactions, we become blind. My mother once told me a story about a creative kid who came to a new school and was excited to hear that they would draw flowers in art class. He began to draw flowers as he imagined them or had observed them from memory, with great variety and attention to detail. The teacher scolded him and then instructed him to follow directions, drawing a generic daisy with a sad single stem and a circle of petals radiating from the top. Some years later, when the boy was given the opportunity to draw whatever he pleased, his instinct had him plop down the same sad stem and circle of petals. Whether or not this is true, it is sad because it's the kind of thing that is so often true. It takes the hopeful imagination of something better to cause our eyes to reopen. We must forget the response to provide answers that teachers and bosses expect, and seeing things as they truly are, imagine that they could change into something new. Stories are the medicine that can heal our damaged eyes, ears, and imagination, but only if we allow ourselves the freedom to wonder if they might be true. Perhaps not in the sense of science or history, but true in the way they reflect the ultimate reality in which we live.